On Law and Crime Report, more information has been released about another crime thought to be linked to deceased anti-feminist attorney Roy Denhollander. Hollander is suspected of committing a shooting at the home of Judge Esther Salas that left her husband injured and her son deceased.
When he left, Mark was dead.
Plus, the attorneys for former Atlanta police officer Garrett Rolfe have filed a motion asking for Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard to be recused from the case.
I can never tell my daughter, oh, he's coming to take you skating.
Later, in the wake of the tragic death of Specialist Vanessa Guevara at the hands of a fellow officer, lawmakers are pushing for several amendments to be included in the annual defense bill to address sexual harassment in the military.
The man killed himself, but my sister was taken away.
Law and Crime Report, where we dive into true crime and all legal stories making headlines. It's Wednesday, July 22nd, 2020. Good afternoon, I'm Brian Buckmeyer, your host here at Law and Crime Report. Let's begin with the story out of Chicago, where a group of family members thought they were going there to mourn the loss of a family member and friend. Instead, it turned into a shootout where about 15 people were injured due to gunshot wounds. Now, the report is that there was somewhat of a drive-by, that a car had driven past the funeral procession after or slightly before that funeral, and gunfire just came screaming out. Now, let's start off by looking at what the First Deputy Eric Carter had to say about the incident.
Began firing at attendees of a funeral. At that time, the attendees of the funeral exchanged gunfire with the black vehicle. Black vehicle then turned northbound down Carpenter. Upon going northbound down Carpenter, they continued to fire at the attendees of the funeral, at which time the vehicle, midway down the block, crashed and came to a halt. The occupants of the vehicle then exited in multiple directions and fled. We currently have a person of interest being interviewed by area detectives at the area. Out of this incident, there are 14 victims being treated at 5 separate area hospitals. Conditions are unknown at this time.
All right, so I'm joined with two guests, Gigi Gonzalez, as well as retired LAPD Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey. Good morning to you both, or good afternoon to you both, sorry. Cheryl, let's start with you. This just seems like something, at least to me as a public defender, out of something you would think to see in a movie or something like that, not something that you would think would be happening in a city in the United States. But lo and behold, we have a shootout between two groups of people during a funeral. What did you make of this story when you first heard of it?
Well, listen, this is not foreign to me. I worked Operation South Bureau C.R.A.S.H, which is our gang unit. And we had these kinds of incidents that we prepared and anticipated could occur because there were shootings regularly back in the 80s here in Los Angeles at gangland funerals. And so how this police department could be caught not prepared is kind of unsettling because, listen, if they have a good rapport with the gangsters in the area, and that's something that you should do, right? You should, as a gang officer, know your gangs, know your participants, pay attention to graffiti. There's always intel that can probably alert you to possibilities. And if you don't have that, you should just prepare anyway. This is not something foreign and new. This has been going on.
Yeah. And Gigi, from your perspective, in terms of there is now a person of interest. They said that a vehicle had crashed. These people scattered. To Cheryl's point, they may have some information as to who the contrary or the contradicting gang may be. There should be an investigation here. What would you think that investigation would start to look like?
Well, just as Detective Cheryl just mentioned, this is the importance of community connections between police officers and the communities that they serve. Right? By obtaining this person of interest, now the detectives are going to be able to investigate what the motives were, right? Why did they choose to attack this particular funeral or these particular people? We're going to figure out who was the targets, why they were targeted, and we're going to be able to figure out exactly what the proper charges will be after this investigation.
Right. Now, this morning, the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, had a presser to discuss the incident at hand. Let's listen.
This news of the shooting at the funeral home and of the 3-year-old would be shocking under any circumstances. But what makes this incident especially heinous is that those shooters took advantage of families and friends who were gathered to mourn the death of a young man who himself had lost his life just the week before. The ongoing battle that seemingly spreads from day to day, block to block, as we fight throughout the summer to end this carnage. And as you heard, in a separate incident about 5 miles away, a 3-year-old in the back seat of her parents' car got shot after the father had an encounter with someone. By the grace of God, she is still with us, but she's in serious condition. To the cowards behind these shootings, and cowards, I think, is the right word here, we have to ask you to find your humanity. The superintendent is right. This senseless violence, this cycle of retaliation, picking up a gun, many times in petty grievances, picking up a gun that solves nothing but causes so much lifelong pain. I pray for you, but I also pray that we find you and that we bring you to justice.
Now, I would also echo the mayor's words there, and Cheryl, why don't you come in on this one first? This does seem to be, at least in my eyes, a cycle of cowardice as well as violence, because to her point, it's easy to pick up a gun and shoot someone, harm them, and then the cycle just continues. They're putting someone's body into the ground, and from my understanding, they lost their life to a gunshot wound as well. And then now you have people continuing that cycle during a time that is so somber and is such a time for reflection, and you throw this into the mix, it seems like this could only escalate. But how, I guess the question would be, how can we de-escalate this as a police force, as a city, and as civilians?
Well, listen, since we know that this is a cycle, right, that means that it's continuing, it's ongoing. And so, again, how they were caught flat-footed, is the question that begs to be answered. And so, listen, when I worked the gang unit, we routinely provided security. We had intel officers who were attending funerals, who monitored the procession. And why this police department didn't do that, I mean, Chicago is almost, if not bigger than Los Angeles, why they didn't put the resources there to stop what's going on. They need to be proactive rather than reactive. This was predictable, in my opinion.
Yeah, and Gigi, I know Cheryl's the expert here, and I'm going to kind of bring that to you for this next question. If this is a question of proactive versus reactive, which I completely agree with Cheryl there, how can we ask our police departments to be more proactive rather than reactive in situations like this? Because to Cheryl's point, if there was more presence there or more intelligence gathering, I don't know if Chicago is saying they're devoid of police officers or devoid of intelligence gathering. I don't know if that's the case. But how can we better use their resources to ensure that this doesn't happen?
I think you both are absolutely right. I think that the police department has a responsibility to open channels of communication between themselves and the communities that they serve so that they could better serve these communities, by understanding what's going on within the communities. They can better protect them. They could make sure that there's more cops posted during these funeral proceedings that could be contentious. I will say this, though, I perhaps maybe the police department's drawback here in this situation was that their resources are stretched too thin. We're also in the midst of a global pandemic that is stretching cities' resources to its very thinnest. So I do agree that the police departments do have a responsibility to communicate with the communities they serve in order to better serve them. But I will say that maybe, just maybe, they are stretched in different directions and couldn't be there at this time.
Now, Cheryl, maybe as the public defender in me, I can see an incident like this being galvanized or utilized by either side of people. We're in the middle of a discussion where we're talking about defunding the police. I can see in one angle you can say, hey, if we had the money to put 20, 30, 40, 50 more people onto this task, this wouldn't have happened. But then inversely, you can have the argument of, well, if you use the money you had and resources you had smarter or in a better way, in the way that you're articulating, maybe you would be better at your job or be better at serving the people here. Do you think that there is valid arguments on both sides, or do you think that this situation leans to more one side than the other? And what are your thoughts?
Well, listen, you can't please everyone. And I know there's a segment of society that talks about defunding the police, but that doesn't necessarily mean reducing the numbers of police. And so it's a matter of deployment and using the resources that you have appropriately. And this was an easy fix. This was something that was predictable. Fights, gunfights. I've seen fights at funerals where they overturn the casket. And so none of this, like I said, is new, and it should have been anticipated. And I heard the Superintendent Brown say that he thought it didn't make sense to have a police presence at the funeral. I disagree. I don't necessarily know if it would have deterred shooters who were cowards and shot from a moving vehicle, but certainly not having their presence there leaves this as an open question. What would have happened if police had been present?
I cannot agree with you more, Cheryl. It definitely seems that someone dropped the ball here, especially when you're listening to the superintendent saying, I didn't believe that it was necessary. Of course, hindsight is 20/20. We can all disagree with him now, but hopefully going forward, there are better steps. And I think some of the steps that you employ there would have been very helpful in this situation. Let's take a quick break and come back with more here, the Law and Crime Report. So yesterday, there was a hearing in the George Floyd case where all of the defendants were present, at least their attorneys were, and there were a few things that were discussed. I want to bring in Gigi Gonzalez to have this discussion starting off. Gigi, some of the main points that I heard were about the gag order. It seemed to me that the defense attorneys were making, I think, a pretty valid argument that Attorney General Keith Ellison was making a lot of statements, some would say maybe some bombastic statements in the media, and they felt that them falling in line with the gag order seemed to put them at a bit of a disadvantage. Now, the judge ended up lifting the gag order, saying that the parties were tiptoeing around it. What did you make of that gag order and how the parties were, I guess, utilizing it, but also kind of hindered by it?
Well, the fact that the gag order was even lifted is interesting in itself. I don't know about you, but that's pretty rare for a judge to lift a gag order. And I think it's an excellent move for the defense because this is a case that has been played out in the court of public opinion since May. I don't think that you can turn on any news channel and at any time and not hear George Floyd's case come up at some point. So the fact that the defense has been unable to go to the media in order to defend their clients on the national stage is an impediment to the defense, because by the time this trial rolls along, potential jurors will have heard every angle of this case except for the defense's angle. So I think that the judge made a really great decision in reversing this gag order.
Yeah. And to your point, Gigi, yeah, I don't think we've seen many gag orders lifted, but let's take a look at some of the public statements, or maybe the exact public statement that led to that gag order being issued.
If they saw the full body camera on my client, I believe that they would have a different opinion, particularly if they had any knowledge of what police procedure is and how they should proceed on a felony arrest, particularly when the individual they are arresting is under the influence of some kind of drug.
Now, other things that were argued in that hearing were that Attorney General Keith Ellison was asked to be held in contempt for his public statements, and the court said they would take it under advisement from the media request that the body-worn camera would be widely distributed. Now, Cheryl, it seems like George Floyd is being argued in the court of public opinion, and it makes sense to some degree. This is the spark that lit a fire across the world, really, in terms of protests about other cases coming up. How do you see the handling of this case, especially for those officers who are doing the investigation and trying to put a case together that will ultimately lead up to trial?
Well, listen, I think there's gamesmanship being played on both sides. Everybody wants their version of what we saw, right? And I don't know that we really need a narration. We saw a police officer sit on a handcuffed suspect for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So beyond that, I don't think there needs to really be much more discussion. But since each one wants to have their version heard, listen, they understand both sides, that there are potential jurors out there that are listening and wanting to know. And as a community, we want more. We always want the details that really should be kind of kept close to the vest and put on in a court rather than in a trial, rather than in the court of public opinion, as you just stated. And so I think that there's blame, if you will, to go on both sides.
Yeah, and whenever we have high-profile cases like this, my thing with cases, sometimes the most pivotal, most important part of the case is jury selection. And I think that this case, the jury selection is going to be absolutely bananas to try to find someone who is not biased on either side of the fence here. It's going to be interesting. Of course, we'll cover it when it happens. But let's switch gears just ever so lightly to the case of Rayshard Brooks, because there was also some motion practice in that case. But there, they were talking about whether or not the district attorney has availed himself to a point that they should be recused from the case. Let's start off with the words of Paul Howard, who is the Fulton County District Attorney, who is announcing the charges of the shooting of Rayshard Brooks.
Mr. Brooks was shot. There is an Atlanta policy that requires that the officers have to provide timely medical attention to Mr. Brooks or to anyone who is injured. But after Mr. Brooks was shot, for some period of 2 minutes and 12 seconds, there was no medical attention applied to Mr. Brooks. But when we examined the videotape and in our discussions with witnesses, what we discovered is during the 2 minutes and 12 seconds that Officer Rolfe actually kicked Mr. Brooks while he laid on the ground, while he was there fighting for his life. Secondly, from the videotape, we were able to see that the other officer, Officer Brosnan, actually stood on Mr. Brooks's shoulders while he was there struggling for his life. We were able to conclude that based on the way that these officers conducted themselves while Mr. Brooks was lying there, that the demeanor of the officers immediately after the shooting did not reflect any fear or danger of Mr. Brooks, but their actions really reflected other kinds of emotions.
So that just shows part of the defense's argument for recusal. You also have to remember that Howard, the prosecutor there, is under investigation by the GBI. Basically, they're saying that Howard allegedly issued subpoenas without the grand jury. Howard claims the subpoenas were issued as merely a mistake. He's also being investigated about a link to a nonprofit. Quote, the GBI has already investigated money, the city of Atlanta money granted to a nonprofit tied to Howard, some $140,000 of which ended up as a salary supplement for the district attorney. And so there's a lot of moving parts into this. Cheryl, do you think with all of this happening, the investigation, Howard's statements, that this could have a negative effect on the case and therefore maybe he should recuse himself?
Well, certainly this case is too big to play with. And I understand that, a lot of what's done is being done because if and when Rolfe is convicted, there will be an appeal based on certain things. And this could be part of that. I don't know. But because this is such a hot button issue, I think that the district attorney should probably recuse himself. He's not a one-man gang over there. I'm sure there's someone else who has the skill set and the expertise to put forth a formidable prosecution. And so rather than run the risk of some technicality because of his own involvement in things that have nothing to do with the Brooks case, I say recuse him and get someone else on board.
I mean, Gigi, Cheryl brings up sound points. As a defense attorney, if the facts are against me, if the law is against me, then I'm going to go straight to the credibility of the people that are prosecuting my client. And we've seen that work in other cases. Could this be a situation where facts and law end up on one side, but because the person who is prosecuting, I think you actually quoted it best, like the person's hands are not bloodied, but they're dirty. I think you've coined that phrase in the past. Could this be a situation for the prosecutor where their hands are a little dirty and therefore it could taint the case?
In this case, I think that the DA's hands are a little bit more than just dirty. He made some pretty inflammatory statements discussing the officers in the Rayshard Brooks case. As a defense attorney, if you're going to start speculating about my demeanor based on a video late at night, I'm going to argue that maybe you're a picture to the media to taint prospective jurors. And not only that, you also have this interesting issue where a nonprofit nonprofit grant was transferred to the DA's salary somehow, some way. You know, it's definitely very sticky, and it's a great move for the defense to call attention to that. But I don't think that the DA is going to step down so easily, because keep in mind that this is an election year. This is a hot topic case that has gained nationwide notoriety, and I don't think that he is going to step down so quickly from it.
Yeah, and I just want to read a few quotes from the motion and some of the arguments that the defense are making. I mean, they're going as far to say that some of his statements, as you were saying, Gigi, they go as far to say they were ethically inappropriate, and that he's potentially, as we were saying earlier, a necessary witness. How he would be a necessary witness, I think, Cheryl, you were kind of bringing up some of those points that your investigation and your involvement in the case may cause him to be called into the case. And of course, we know that neither a defense attorney nor a prosecutor can be called into a case as a witness because there are conflicts of interest there. And so he would have to be recused. I guess, Cheryl and Gigi, I'll just ask you just quickly, and you can kind of elaborate. Cheryl first, do you think that from what you've seen so far, that there's a potential for recusal here?
Absolutely. We don't want this case to become about the district attorney. This is an officer who shot and killed a man who was running away from him in the back, and that needs to be the singular focus. So if there are other things that are going to distract from that point, then it needs to be removed.
Yeah, and I know that you both had commented on some of the politics in the background, it being an election year, him probably wanting a big feather in the cap. So he may not choose to recuse himself personally, but he may be pushed to do so. Gigi, same question. Do you think that this is a situation where he might actually end up being recused from this case?
Absolutely. There's just too much mud in the water right now for him to be able to justify his presence in this case.
All right. So let's take a quick break. We're going to come back to more at Law and Crime Report with other true crime cases and major legal headlines. All right, so let's move the topic to Portland, Oregon. For most of us, we've been hearing the stories coming out of the city. Since July 4th, there's been a federal presence in the city, and there seems to be, at least until this point, about 43 reported federal arrests. Now, the presence of the federal police or forces has grown to the point that there's some scrutiny as to their practices. There's been stories of them snatching people from the street, and it seems to me that for the most part, the opposite side is saying, well, they're there to protect federal property and to protect citizens. However, there seems to be a lot of controversy against this. The Oregon AG has sued, requesting a restraining order against the federal offices. Let's look at a clip from MSNBC talking about the subject.
What are you doing? Use your words. What are you doing? Use your words. What are you doing? I haven't done anything wrong. Use your words.
What's going on? Tell me.
What is going on?
We need to know.
Who are you?
Why are you taking?
NLG will get you out. What's your name? Tell us your name.
What's your name?
Okay, you're fine. We'll get you out.
Bro, what?
We got you, friend.
We got you.
Oh, fuck.
NLG.
You just violated their rights.
Oh. Kidnapping people.
You just violated their rights.
Thanks for keeping them fucking. Oh.
Oregon residents being snatched off the street like that by who knows who has now given rise to a new lawsuit by Oregon State Attorney General, who's suing 4 federal agencies, asking a judge for a restraining order to stop their operations in Oregon streets. Quote, ordinarily, a person exercising his right to walk through the streets of Portland is confronted by anonymous men in military-type fatigues and ordered into an unmarked van can reasonably assume that he's being kidnapped and is the victim of a crime, making it impossible for citizens to determine whether they are being kidnapped by militia or other malfeasants dressed in paramilitary gear or are being arrested.
We brought this lawsuit because we had enough of it. The governor and the mayor of Portland asked these people to leave. They won't leave. The acting interim Secretary of Homeland Security says they're staying. And the president announced today that he's sending these troops. Maybe it'll get them out of Portland, but I don't really relish them going to any other places and engaging this similar type of behavior, because it's outrageous. It's a violation of the Constitution, and we're not standing for it.
Now, this seems to be scary times for these protesters, especially when you don't see or know who the entity or what they are doing. I mean, it says there that you don't know whether or not they're federal agents, they're police officers, or a militia, and they're bringing you into an unmarked vehicle. Cheryl, let's bring you in on this one. This seems like it could be a recipe for disaster in some areas, because in my mind, what happens if a registered gun owner or licensed gun owner sees this, gets reasonably scared, and there ends up being a firefight? What did you make of this incident?
This is problematic for me because, listen, how many of these people who have been snatched up and taken away were never seen again? I mean, we don't know. And it could be a combination. There is an admission now that some of these officers that are out there are Border and Customs Patrol agents, but there could be a mix of just, Bubba from around the way and his cousin Jeb in the group as well, because they're all unknown. Their faces are covered. They're not wearing any insignia. You're being put in a vehicle and taken where, for what reason? And some of them have reportedly been released when they asserted their rights. And so all of this is problematic. And more importantly for me, I'm concerned that this isn't a test run for what might happen. Let's say if by chance this president isn't reelected, are they going to have anonymous folks show up at the White House to keep him from being removed physically? This is very unsettling.
I mean, I'm watching this, Gigi, and I'm agreeing with Cheryl wholeheartedly. And from my perspective, I don't have the retired LAPD sergeant perspective, so I don't see this and say, well, that's bad tactics, that's bad tactics. I'm looking at it and seeing constitutional violation, constitutional violation, constitutional violation. And I think however you look at it, it starts to get very scary, and you start to ask yourself, where are we right now? What country are we in? When you look at this as a defense attorney as well, Gigi, what are you making of this?
This is terrifying. And let me tell you what, just a personal note, I am the product of Cubans who escaped a regime that was doing this exact type of thing to their own citizens. If you spoke out against the government, some person would throw you into a vehicle and your family members would never see you again just because you spoke out against the government. And to see that playing out before our very eyes here in the United States, where we have constitutional protections installed for this very reason, is incredibly terrifying. When I see this from a defense perspective, I'm thinking to myself, why aren't you addressing who you are? Why aren't you announcing, I'm a federal agent, you're being arrested for this, I'm taking you here, tell your family that you're going to be released here? Why aren't you abiding by the constitutional rights that are here, are present within our citizens? It's very terrifying. I think Cheryl made an excellent point with the types of tactics that they're using, and the fact that the president is unleashing these tactics on liberal cities during an election year is equally terrifying. Are these agencies being motivated by the president to attack particular people? Are these agencies who they even say they are? Are they vigilantes? Are they ICE? We don't know anything about this. And quite frankly, it's very, very disturbing.
Yeah. And the problem that I see, especially when it comes, and we're just going like lowest common denominator in terms of problems that I see here. If you're using ICE agents, if you're using DHS agents, if you're using Border Patrol agents, they operate on a very different standard of search and seizure and the ability to arrest and detain people, because those rights are very different if you are entering or exiting through a border than if you are, for example, just walking through Portland. So if they're implementing their ideologies of the Fourth Amendment or other amendments while in a city or in a state, you are absolutely violating people's rights, and that becomes an even greater issue because even your standard is incorrect in working with these people. But the Portland mayor, Ted Wheeler, took to CNN in a statement and said, quote, federally directed intervention is uninvited, untrained, and unwelcomed. She later on went on to say that the acting secretary knows that we feel this way, but we're happy to tell him again, and also that the violence was being contained and started to de-escalate before they arrived. They intervened and escalated the tensions to a new level. This seems to be the exact opposite of what people are asking for. It seems that they're saying they do not trust the police force as it is now. They're untrained and unable to understand the needs of the community. And then this just seems like they're saying, well, you know what? let's put just more gas on the fire and maybe it will go away. Cheryl, is this a misstep? Or is this just blatantly them trying to just put their foot on people and say, you need to listen to us?
I think this is this president pushing the envelope and seeing how much foolishness he can get away with, because we now know that he's threatened to send these same anonymous forces to Chicago, to Philadelphia, and to New York, not because there's any protection of federal monuments or statutes or grounds that are needed there, but because he wants to exert his authority over Black folks who don't think like him, look like him, and see whether or not he can get away with it. And I think ultimately, this is, like I said, this is testing for what this militia group can do anonymously whenever he wants to deploy them for whatever reason. November to January 2021 is going to be very interesting.
Now, a number of mayors sent a letter to Attorney General William Barr, and the letter was signed by some of the mayors, Cheryl, that you're actually speaking about. It was signed by mayors in Portland, Seattle, Atlanta, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Boston, Philadelphia, Denver, Los Angeles, San Jose, Oakland, Tucson, Sacramento, Phoenix, and Kansas City, Missouri. They're all calling on the administration to withdraw federal forces from the cities where they're currently deployed or to halt sending them elsewhere. I mean, I've never been to Portland, Oregon. I know that every city has its own kind of vibe or kind of culture. But Gigi, I know you're in Miami. I'm in Brooklyn. I can't imagine, at least for me in New York, how federal agents in New York City would work out in terms of the population we have here. I could see a lot more pushback. Can you see how the different cultures, the different environments in these cities could have some dangerous results if federal agents came and did what they're doing in Portland into these other cities?
Absolutely. And I couldn't help but notice that a bunch of the cities that were just listed aren't necessarily liberal cities. I think that a lot of those cities are also Republican cities or more conservative cities. So you're going to see a lot of different types of pushback. I think that you're going to see the same type of pushback where you have minority dominated cities, right? Where people are coming out to protest in big numbers, where, President Trump has considered these cities to be filled with violent anarchists and not protesters. You're going to see a lot of interesting pushback depending on the types of protesters we see in those cities.
Yeah. Before we move on and go to the break, I know we're talking about this issue of federal agents coming into these cities and implementing through force. Part of the fear, I think, and I think you're kind of seeing it as we have experts from both the law enforcement as well as the defense. We're looking and talking about this, but it's hard to evaluate this from a legal standpoint because there's so little precedence as to how this occurs. I wouldn't know how to educate my client who came through to Raymond's and said, hey, I was arrested. And I said, okay, by who? And I said, I don't know, someone in fatigue. Well, what did you say to them? What did they say to you? Where did they bring you? What items did they take off of you? Where are they vouchered? There are so many procedures that police departments have to follow to ensure that constitutional rights are kept up, are implemented for those people. But the way and the manner in which these arrests and these detentions are happening of federal agents, there is no roadmap for this. And when there's no roadmap for constitutional rights, that's when we find ourselves lost, and that's when we find those constitutional rights falling by the wayside. We'll continue more here at the Law and Crime Report after this break. The story of Vanessa Guevara out of the military is one that I think is especially tragic, but one that we can all get behind, of that there needs to be implementations to ensure this doesn't happen again. Now, for almost 2 months, she went missing. And in that 2 months, the family desperately reached out to anyone and everyone. They eventually went up to their local and state representatives, and it's through that avenue that her body was eventually found. Now, it was found mutilated, and the suspect is believed to be another service member. That person, many believe, had committed suicide, and so they're not quite sure, but the investigation still continues as to who the perpetrator is and the motive behind this just horrible and senseless murder. Now, there are new amendments that are being introduced to hope to decrease this from happening again. because we're also getting reports that she was a victim of sexual assault, but was too fearful to step forward in the environment in which she was in to say that what was happening to her. Let's start off by going to the family's reaction when they had to identify her remains.
Speak about it, because we cannot let this happen again. We cannot just, oh, okay, the man killed himself, but my sister was taken away. It could have been your sister, your friend.
Have you been able to process what happened?
No. I still can't accept it, to be honest with you. It's been really, like, I'm dreaming and I just don't accept it.
Now, reports are saying that the suspect's name is David Aaron Robinson, and that, again, that the victim in this case, Vanessa Guevara, had reports to her family, at least, that she was a victim of sexual assault, but spoke about a culture or an environment where she did not feel safe to come forward with these allegations. Again, I'm joined with two of our contributors here at the Law and Crime Trial Network, Gigi Gonzalez, as well as Cheryl Dorsey. Gigi, let's start with you. I think it's obvious that the military is very heavy in terms of a male presence. And so there have been reports, even before Guillen, that for a woman to report sexual harassment in that environment, it is extremely difficult. They often go unheard. And sometimes the person that they're reporting the sexual assault about is the person they're supposed to be reporting to, their supervisor or something of that effect. Can you talk to us about how sexual assault is really embedded in this case and how it maybe have led to this tragic end?
Yeah, so the culture, definitely doesn't allow for a lot of reporting to occur, which is why this amendment is even being proposed in the first place. Recently, a lot of female service members have been uploading their accounts on Twitter describing how difficult it is for them to be able to report their instances of sexual assault for the reasons you said. The people that they are supposed to be reporting to is the actual person who committed the assault, or their buddies with the person who committed the assault. And because this is a male-dominated career and area, they don't feel like there is a true avenue for them to really gain any justice or to get any justice. I think the amendments proposed here are going to solve two very critical issues. The first is the length of time to even investigate missing persons. I'm surprised that a service person could be missing for so long without anyone really trying to investigate it. And the Second Amendment is also going to allow for a confidential line for people who are victims of sexual assault to be able to report and not receive consequences for it, because the fear is they're going to be retaliated against. They're going to be, shipped out to some other part of the military, or they're going to be kicked out of the military altogether. So the ability to be able to report without retaliation is vital in reversing the culture of sexual assault in the military.
Yeah, so Gigi, you outlined it perfectly, the two amendments there, comparing and contrasting the investigation techniques for missing persons from a military standpoint and from a civilian standpoint, and to ensure that the military is using best practices. And then, of course, as you said, the confidential reporting process for sexual harassment to be integrated into the program that they call Catch a Serial Offender. Now, Cheryl, we're hearing more and more details about this tragic loss of this specialist. We're being told that from their investigation, Robinson bludgeoned the 20-year-old soldier with a hammer at Fort Hood and later dismembered her and buried her remains in the woods. There also seems to be a civilian who helped Robinson to dispose of Guillen's body. And that person is currently under arrest. That's a 22-year-old who's been charged with 1 count of conspiracy to tamper with evidence. That's Cecile Aguilera that you see there, a 22-year-old. As this investigation continues, we're finding out that that defendant there was actually the estranged wife of the former soldier who was stationed at Fort Hood. Cheryl, as a retired LAPD sergeant, when you hear all of these facts that it happened at Fort Hood, that it was a service member, that it was another person who helped out, does this seem to be just like poor preparation, poor investigation? Where would you put your finger on the button to say this is the fault, this is the issue we need to solve in terms of this just blunder of a mess?
I think the problem is that, first of all, and I've been a victim of retaliation, having been a whistleblower on the Los Angeles Police Department as well as at the Los Angeles Unified School District. And I know that the highest levels of authority on organizations that are quasi-military will come for you. And so what I say to anyone who is a victim is don't allow them to operate in a vacuum, because there's no guarantee that if you're quiet and if you don't say anything and if you're a good little soldier, no pun intended, that they will leave you be. And so if you find yourself a victim, go public. I'd say, write letters, make phone calls, send emails, go on social media platforms now that we have them, and make sure that others know that you are suffering mightily and that you are seeking assistance, because this is not unique to the military. This goes on in the police department and in other agencies. As we know, retaliation is real. We saw what happened in the cabinet of this president when folks told of wrongdoing and malfeasance. And so it's important to go public.
Yeah, and I think especially in this country, when we put so much pride in our service members and so much pride in our police department, we have to support those when they do come out, as you said, Cheryl, and to create an environment so that they do feel that ability, especially in situations of retaliation, sexual harassment, and other parts of their employment. I don't mean to switch gears, but we've got one last story. Let's talk about the case of Roy Denhollander, who was found dead in the Catskills. We know that our very own Linda Kenny Bodden wrote a story at Law and Crime. Go check that article out. She went there to see where his body was found and wrote a beautiful article. But they're starting to say that there are some connections between the shooting at the New Jersey judge's home that left her 20-year-old son dead and her husband injured, with a shooting in California for another pro-male activist because of the similarities in which they were killed, that being that both suspects wore a FedEx uniform. Let's take a quick look at more information.
Horrendous. None of us in the movement, none of his friends ever anticipated anything ever happening. And when I got the call, it was devastating.
Harry Crouch is president of the National Coalition for Men. He says he's known Mark Angelucci for more than 20 years and that the 52-year-old served as vice president of the organization.
Was loved by virtually everybody in the men's rights movement. He was like our right leg.
According to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, Angelucci was shot and killed at his Crestline home on July 11th. Crouch says he learned from people at the home that the shooter was dressed as a delivery person.
Apparently somebody came to the house, posed as a delivery person, and when he left, Mark was dead. Well, I immediately saw a link, but he's not, I want to be real clear. He's not an NCFM member. Why is he? Isn't he? Because I threw him out 5 or 6 years ago because he was a nut job.
So Gigi, we're seeing senseless killings on both sides of the country here in California and New Jersey. And again, it seems to be, if the connection is there, from one very troubled, I will use that politely because those other words are probably better suited for him, but one very troubled individual who was on a vendetta, and it appears that he was on that vendetta because he was close to death and he wanted to kind of clear his ledger, as it appeared. What did you make of this story and the possible connection between the two killings?
I think it's an interesting connection, right? You have two shootings that occurred by a suspect in a FedEx uniform. We know that Hollander was the suspect in the shooting of Judge Salas's family. So the connection it's there. So now we have to ask, did Hollander travel to California recently? Could we put Hollander in California at the time of the shooting somehow? When did Hollander get this FedEx uniform? There's a lot of things that we have to answer before we can draw a strong connection between the two. But there's no doubt that they are intersecting facts, right? They're both part of the, Hollander was a member of the National Coalition for Men, and Angelucci was a vice president there. So it could be that Hollander has sour feelings towards the people that kicked him out of a coalition that he fought so hard to defend the interests of.
Absolutely. Now, I want to thank you both, Gigi and Cheryl, for being here. Cheryl, I want to give you the final words, though, before we head out. Of course, I'll be here next week, and we'll have regular programming afterwards. But Cheryl, in the last 20 seconds or so, talk to us about the investigation we're about to see in this case.
Well, you know, there's so much unknown by us. I mean, certainly the investigators have information that we're not privy to, and rightfully so.
Cheryl, I got to cut you off. I apologize. Okay. My timing was off there, but thank you very much. We're going to continue more. We have regular scheduling after this. See you tomorrow.